This was a very last minute announcement, and we do have somebody. This is a Macedonian researcher. Is currently, I believe, in Kuwait.
Yes, Kuwait.
So excellent. We have audience.
Can we do a screenshot at the end, right?
Yes, of course.
Yeah, absolutely.
Of course, no problem.
Yeah. All right. So let's gather around. And we're gonna do this as a podcast with an audience. I think it's the right way to do it. We do have a full room here in person at Polytechnique.
Lower I'll do the screen so I see. Otherwise, I'm muted.
It's
All
like
right.
I don't know if it goes any lower. Like that.
Thank you so much.
Yeah,
All right.
perfect. And we do also, we just realized that we could stream this. So I just sent an announcement about an hour ago, and it is on Zoom also. We will post it on the YouTube channel. I'm very happy to be joined by Caroline Boudoux, who actually gave a wonderful 1-hour lecture to the class, and we got a lot of engagement. So I was very happy to see that. First, I would like to just hear Caroline's life story once again. I think it would be nice to just hear, just how you got to professor at Polytechnique, co-founder of a company, and a very successful entrepreneur. So maybe you can tell us a bit about your path to here.
So we have 3-4 hours, right? That's what.
Take all the time.
All right.
You're the one that's busier. So.
All right. Well, thank you very much for having me, and thank you to everyone in the audience for asking in the classroom for asking questions. That was very engaging. So I've been at Polytechnique since 2007, professor of engineering physics and also biomedical engineering. I'm a researcher at Saint-Justine, which is down the road here. And I came here after a postdoc at Polytechnique Paris and a PhD in the Harvard, MIT, HSC, Health Sciences and Technology division. And so then I was working on taking an idea in biomedical optics and making it translational and reaching the clinical stage. And joining Polytechnique, I came here because there was an international expert on fiber optic components called Nicolas Godbout. He's now the chair of our department.
But you're originally from Laval?
I'm from Quebec City. So Montreal was actually a new city for me. I took a chance on Montreal. I came for the interview, and it was interesting because everyone assumed that I knew Montreal, right? So they brought me back to the hotel, but there was no sightseeing involved. So I had to discover Montreal as I became a professor here. And started working on new fiber optics to improve OCT and confocal microscopy. And it turns out that with the legacy from the fiber optics lab and the new ideas bringing in and the really talented pool of students at Polytechnique, very quickly we brought an idea to life, and that led to creating a company called Castor Optics, in very strong strategic partnership with Thor Labs. And so they've been really instrumental in helping two academics, shaping up as business people.
Who's the second academic?
Nicolas Godbout. So Nicolas from the Laboratoire des Fibres Optiques joined and met with two angels, so strategic investors, Normand Brez, a serial entrepreneur in Montreal and great polymath as well, and Alex Cable from New Jersey, great scientist, great entrepreneur. And I think that was a key also to be joined by scientists. Because our board meetings, once we make sure the numbers are okay, we very rapidly move into science and new applications and what if, and that also keeps it super fun.
How did you time this? So did you become a professor and then start a company?
That's a good question. So I think I had tenured. So I was not full professor, but I was tenured for sure. So I joined in 2007, probably got tenured by 11 or 12, started a company in 13.
Okay.
Yeah.
And since then, you've been very active in mentoring students. You teach CAP courses here. Yeah. You're also a parent. I know that that's a full-time job.
Talked about it, yeah.
And there was a question on Slido, which is our question asking, how do you do it all? I think it would be interesting to hear it.
So the first thing, and so you're an imaging expert, so you'll understand my analogy here, but never forget when you hear anyone telling you about, their careers, it's always a maximum intensity projection, right? So you have a slide of everything that happened in the past 3 decades, right? So I'm just going to say one step at a time, one day at a time. I'm also particularly lazy, so the tasks that I don't want to do, I end up, forgetting about them and it sorts itself out, or sometimes I have to do it, right?
No, I think this actually is something that I heard from William Perry, who was the former Minister of Defense or Department of Defense, Secretary of State of the US, who lived at Stanford, who taught at Stanford and lived in this retired community where he would give lectures. And he said that the best way that he got things done is he would put a long to-do list, and basically he would never work on the one thing he was supposed to work on. But that one thing was something with a long time horizon that could take a lot of time. And then he would just check off all the other things that seemed easier or manageable. And then he would leave that kind of one big project for the future. And there was always a bigger project that was waiting while he was finishing up smaller projects.
So it's true that you have to, so Eisenhower, also to quote, you know, American politics, said that two types of problems would arrive on his desk, or land on his desk, the important ones and the urgent ones.
Exactly.
And as humans, we're triggered to tackling the urgent, but you need to make appointments in your schedule for the important ones. So I do make appointments with myself. Writing a book doesn't happen by, you know, at one point you have to say, I'm blocking these 2 hours, and you treat it as a dentist appointment, right? If an emergency comes up, you cancel a dentist, but typically, you know, you don't take phone calls during a dentist appointment, right? So you block your time to do it.
And you also, in your book, you also mentioned this Parkinson's law, which is, you know, the tasks tend to take up the space you occupy.
Absolutely.
You got
And
a lot to them. So
I think it was easy before I had a kid, right? Because your schedule is elastic. When you're single, you can work through a night. That's fine. You don't do that every year, every day, right? You don't. But it's okay to pull in a one nighter once in a while. With a kid, you can't, because you never know when they'll dictate when you take a real all-nighter. And so you need to be ready for them if they have a nightmare, if they have, you know, a dentist appointment. Yeah.
So that brings us to the book you wrote. I would really like us to talk a bit about it. I don't know how many of you are aware. I mean, I told you, so now you're aware. How many of you have maybe read it or started reading it? Ah, okay.
All right. Very
You
cool.
have a couple. So I got my copy. It was in the summer, and I promised Caroline that I will read it, and I did read it, cover to cover.
Actually, your review was very convincing.
And I honestly enjoyed it way more than I thought. You know, like my initial reaction was, it's a self-help book, right? And you know, those tend to be filler. But here, I found a book that had 2 out of 3 sections that really hit a spot, and I completely agree with them. And then one section where I was like, wow, we're so different.
That's interesting.
That I do want to discuss that part. But basically, for those that don't know, I've been telling students not to do a PhD, okay? Jane knows that. Because I think there's better ways to use your time, in particular because salary is low, academic prospects are bad. And I personally feel that a PhD is only for those people that after you tell them they really shouldn't do it, they still come back at you and say, you know what? I think I still want to do this. And it's been a good recipe to get great researchers in my lab, but it's also been, you know, a poor way to recruit and attract people. Now, I think I will update and say, and by the way, read Caroline's book and then make up your mind, because you have a very eloquent way of making something that is very cynical sound pragmatic. And, you know, all these problems, I think you put a very positive spin on them. So
thank you. So I'm very much forward looking, and my life really is filled with, you know, rainbows and unicorns. But also, I think this approach of, I think academia has been filtering for a long time. We're saying we're only going to take the people who survive this initial filter and this irony. But I'm also looking at it from an industry perspective, right? So only 1 in 10 will become a faculty. Being an academic after a PhD is really the alternate career, because 9 out of 10, you know, go to industry and have great careers. And the PhD was a way to frame their thinking and to foster curiosity. And so you can have a great career. You do have great careers in industry. And I'm looking at it from the entrepreneur side, you know, a huge part of my payroll goes to people with PhDs and engineers and higher education. So I think you know, imagine that I'm going to see HR and I say, only recruit from half the population, right? We can't do that. So we have to start saying, we need to recruit from all the population, men, women. We need to recruit from, in my case, my father had a PhD. So of course, my father helped me.
Tintinologist, is that correct?
Tintinologist, both my parents are, but that's not what he got his PhD on.
Okay.
But yeah, but so I had a leg up because whenever I applied in first year undergrad, I applied for internship. I always had my father over my shoulder and say, yeah, this is interesting, but how about you phrase it this way? And right, so that was, but not everyone has a PhD on their shoulder, guiding them. So I think this book was meant to open the door to people who are, first generation into academia, face some sort of barriers to entry, and open the doors, because we need more PhDs. We need more people who want to build new technologies, to design new things, as opposed to people from Canada and America only going for MBAs and managing other countries in innovation. So I think we need to have more doers and more creators here.
So the title of the book is It Goes Without Saying. It's right here. And maybe you can say why you picked that title.
So the idea really is to make the implicit explicit. And unfortunately, someone had already taken that title related to PhD education, saying making the implicit explicit. I think this is the essence of the book. Is it goes without saying, but it's so much better once you say it. It was a saying by Haddock in the conversation with Captain Haddock and Tintin. But because my parents were Tintinologists, this is every time I would ask a question and someone would have to state the obvious for me to grow, the other one would say, it goes without saying. So it's a phrase that I've had over and over in my childhood. But it's another way to say, when you've read the book, there's no rocket science.
No.
There's nothing in that book that is, completely, flabbergasting or complete brand new. It's everything that we know after doing a PhD. And I bundled it so you learn about it before. Because very few people are doing 2 PhDs. That's right. So you can't use the knowledge from one PhD to do the second one, right? So the idea is to get the knowledge beforehand.
For my postdoc, who's probably going to listen to this, Aga Karakuzu, who actually won one of the best theses at Polytechnique, he has 2 PhDs.
All right. So
he actually interrupted his PhD in Turkey to come and do a PhD with me. But I agree, it's a very rare subset.
All right.
So Aga, this was for you. So I'll tell you the moment where you got me with this book. First, on page 3, she addresses this issue of, you're not going to make money. It's true in the short term, but 20, 30 years post high school graduation, PhDs will overtake the engineers and the bachelor and master students.
And I think so you can take it literally as you're not going to make money, right? And it's also, we have to remember as advisors that this is a 5-year journey with job insecurity and really crappy conditions. Sorry for using bad words on your podcast. But it's also opening the doors to money cannot be your primary motivation. So now you're entering your PhD, you're full of motivation, crystallize it, find out what it is, such that when 3 years down the road where you lack motivation, you can go back to that day and say, okay, why did I get this started in the first place? So yes, it's a little bit tongue in cheek saying you're not going to make money, but the real message is you can't do a PhD just for the money. It has to be for curiosity, for intrinsic reasons, and certainly not because your parents want you to.
Absolutely. And the second point that was a bit later in the book, where basically I realized that you're very comfortable with it takes all kinds of PhDs.
Yeah.
And there is that one section where you say no department ever puts it in writing that you have to write 3 academic papers to get a PhD. And as somebody who wrote 0, I never wrote a paper during my PhD. I was like, she gets it. That, there isn't a one-size-fits-all.
Then writing that, I also learned that you can never, ever, ever write a sentence that says there is no, because of course I found this one department in the world that says you need 3 papers. So now this also comes as a reminder to also read the endnotes, because they're very funny and they're everything that I couldn't say in the text, but I really want to, side messages. But yes, there is one department that I know of that, but truly your real contribution is the thesis, right? No one's going to read it, but right, the real contribution is in the thesis. But I'm not saying you shouldn't publish. I think publication, I see it as a pay it forward model. You were given a position in a lab because someone else before you published. making your advisor credible, allowing your advisor to get a grant so that you can have. And so if you publish, then you perpetuate the cycle. And publication is a currency of science. Wouldn't you agree, right? This is but as a student, the thesis should be enough in and of itself.
No, and I think it really comes down to that. There's no one right way to do a PhD.
Absolutely.
I feel that,
Yeah.
that is a very strong message, and it comes across very clearly here.
I'm glad it did.
So I really appreciated that all of my cynical complaints in your book found, a solution, that
Alright.
there is a way around these hangups that I have.
That's very cool.
Now, my biggest
Yeah.
hang-up is part 2.
Yep.
Where you give a very structured outline on how to write your project proposal, manage your time,
Yeah.
break down all of the little components that make up a PhD.
Yep.
And to me, that felt like a very MBA-like approach.
Mhm.
It felt like a very business school approach, whereas there's a lot of categories and schematics, and you fill the boxes and you advance a PhD as you go. So maybe you can tell us about
Yeah.
that process.
So it's true that not everything can be mapped out day one because it's research. And if we knew what we're going to found, it wouldn't be called research, right?
Yeah.
But so it's a balance between right? There's the Ross Geller approach where you spend half your days, in a sitcom, in a cafe, chatting with your friends.
Is that Friends?
That's
Like,
right.
okay,
Yeah.
okay.
I was throwing you a lifeline here, right there. And then, and the other one that is super mapped out. But there has to be an in-between where you say, all right, now, so message number 1, you have to be in the driver's seat of your PhD, right? You cannot just wait for people to give you tasks. You cannot just go to school, do your time and have a degree. You need to have a project, and you need to have advanced the frontier of knowledge in a somewhat autonomous fashion and then we describe autonomy as growing, and you have a mentor. But once you're in engineering, and very few PhDs happen spending half your days in a cafe, right? Because you need equipment, very expensive equipment. You need to have collaborators, right? The scope of your project depends on the team. So you have a team to manage, you have instruments to book, because sometimes you have to share the MRI or the system with many people. And so there has to be some structure to the project component. But there's also, I hope you saw that there's also a path for finding the right question and creativity and trying to have a concept map to really find what's the right question for you. Also, where does your project fit? Is it consideration of use, consideration of knowledge? Where do you fit? But once you have your project, I think especially here at Polytechnique, where you have a certain number of years, right? You cannot do a 10-year PhD at Polytechnique. So there's at one point in and this is also why it's part 2, because at first we give you the luxury of 1 year in meandering and just finding out who you are, what you want to do, what's the best project. But at one point you have to start looking at your graduation dates and count backwards. And because if you do that, then you'll ask yourself, is it too ambitious, right? If I have all these tasks and I sum them up, am I exploding the timeline? If so, can I have extra resource? Can I have interns and you cannot just have interns like that. Interns need to be funded, recruited, trained. So if you think your project is too ambitious and you need to have interns, you need to plan for it 3 months ahead of time. So I'm not planning by the minute, but by semester, certainly. Yeah.
I think, this is very comforting in the way that, again, all these things have probably been internalized during my PhD studies and me as a professor, but I've never asked the students to do things that way.
Mhm.
And I may be serving certain students, but, not really realizing that other people could really use this kind of.
May I? Yeah, I'm trying to find, I don't know if I can do it really quickly, but there's this curve on, oh, well, that was quick. All right. So there's this curve here on autonomy where I'm looking at and I'll show you guys afterwards, but it's essentially, we're asking that the doctoral contribution be done in an autonomous fashion, but it's not like you go to bed after your undergrad or your master's, you wake up the next day and you're fully autonomous in a lab, right? So it has to be gradual. And typically the people who are sure to graduate are the prodigies, people who start, they were super autonomous to start with, and then it grows and it's stellar. And these people don't need to don't need to read my book. I'm talking to everyone else, people who follow the standard curve and people who follow a late blooming stage where, you know, there's much more hand holding, we need to explain and so on. So in here, we discuss strategies. What happens if you find yourself in one of the two bottom curves? Why can this be, and how can you address this?
No, I think that's perfect. And I really do believe that with this book, my pep talk would have more power. Because, you know, hear my perspective and then hear the perspective of somebody who gets it, but gives you tools that I cannot give my students. You know, like that's just not the way that I function.
And perhaps it's a sign that I wasn't a prodigy, right? So I needed to find a way to fit in, surrounded by prodigies. And I think we should open the doors to not just graduate the prodigies, but because society needs more little gray cells. That's Agatha Christie. That's what you get. Not friends, but you get Agatha Christie. That's good, right? So we need to open the doors to have a greater diversity of PhDs, because we have a greater diversity of problems, and just we need to have more little gray cells to tackle them.
Cool. That's perfect. Now, I will mention one more thing that I thought was lacking in the book, and maybe it's for, you know, the second edition.
Absolutely.
And then, you know, maybe we can open it up for questions from the students. So, you know that for me, reproducibility is a big part of my research. And you did mention a little bit that, you know, we need to avoid plagiarism. We need to have ethics in research. We need to make it easy for other people to reproduce our work. But I thought that the book could use a little bit more emphasis on the kinds of deliverables that usually don't get credit, but should. And then there's, you know, the DORA, San Francisco Declaration for...
I mentioned a little bit of open access, I think,
yes,
and talking about predatory publishing a little bit.
You did.
But you're right that this is what has the greatest impact often, right? You have a code, you make it available for people to use, and all of a sudden, right, this explodes. So I have a friend in my lab finished his PhD. He wrote the code for a PSOCT and finished his PhD with 27 publications, because everyone in the lab who used the code put his name as a co-author, right? So yeah, absolutely. It should have put more emphasis on this.
And finally, the most controversial question. I'm curious how you're gonna, you know, address that, but you talk a lot about networking, and that's very important. You know, there's no doubt. I thought I'm doing a PhD to get away from networking, and all my life I've actually been going headlong in that direction. Eventually you realize you have to network. But there is kind of a dark side of networking, which is having a high profile, recognized scientist as a mentor really increases your chances of being high profile and recognize yourself. Now, it could be a correlation, it could be a causation. We're not really sure. But do you think that students need to reach for the highest profile person they could get to be their PhD supervisor? Or should they just go by picking somebody they click with?
I think I would answer with your first observation about diversity. I think it's one sure way, right? But then you're also in the shadows of that person, right? Because with notoriety and name recognition comes expectations as well, right? So if you're coming out of such a successful lab with very few of your own, then right, it's not the same as coming from an up-and-coming lab and being the superstar. I went the opposite direction. Now it'd be silly because my PhD advisors are now absolute superstars, no denying it. But I was their first student. So I joined a team where everything had to be built, the name had to be made, right? So I picked a different approach, and we're literally sitting in the same spot 20 years later.
No, I mean, that's wonderful. And for me, really, the personality of the mentor made the biggest difference.
I think the match,
I
absolutely.
think, you know, unless you click, it's going to be difficult because
it's going to be difficult. And so the lab culture is, so we always talk about company culture and industry culture, right? And you need to find a good match for you. Lab culture, absolutely critical, can make or break a PhD. Make or break a PhD, absolutely.
Great. I think this is a point where we could open it up to the audience and maybe get some questions. So, Alyssa, please.
Yeah, you mentioned having difficulties writing your book. I wanted to know, like, what were the difficulties? Was it more like the writing process, the editing, or was it like getting it published?
Oh, maybe we can reword the question because you're far away. So the biggest difficulties writing your book, was it the writing, the planning, the publishing? What was,
So this is my fourth book. So, and every book came with a different set of challenges. This one is, as you said, it's close to self-help, right? So, and I started with many people teaching before me who were very generous in giving me their material, but they wrote the material with the heuristics that came with end of career. This is what I think. And I found it very interesting that, you know, when we're scientists, you would never put an anecdote in a science paper, right? Whenever you put a science paper, it's backed by literature, backed by research, backed by numbers, blah, blah, blah. And all of a sudden, we write a book on how to do a PhD, and all of a sudden, heuristics is everything. I think, I believe, blah, blah. And so instead, I would take each of these statements, each of these a priorities that I had, and I had to look up what does social science say about this, right? One sure way to waste time is this. What are the ways to waste time? And so you'll see the reference section is quite extensive because everything that I stated, I backed by research. And I'm not a social scientist, so doing the 300 paper bibliography, clearly I could not piggyback on what I had done for my PhD. So it's a whole new body of literature. I wanted to look at my, blind spots and doing 360 and what people have written about this topic before. So just it's starting a whole new research field. So I treated that as a research project, and every statement that I made is either backed by research, backed by a survey, backed by more than just my heuristics.
Yeah.
Cheers.
What would you say was the most daring or the most transitional step in your career?
All of them, right? In hindsight, right?
just to paraphrase, so most daring transition in your career?
I felt that every step I took, whenever it's the first time, you step outside your comfort zone, and it's always terrifying. There's no other words. So every step, writing a new book, writing was hard. And then the prospect of people actually reading it, that's terrifying, right? And so starting a company, every step was terrifying. Every time you step outside of your comfort zone, but the world is not so cruel as we think it is. And people help you along the way.
So, Professor Jacob, you mentioned discouraging students to not do a PhD, and in the book, it's more of encouraging some students to do a PhD. Is it possible to have a number one reason from your perspective of not doing a PhD, and from Professor Boudoux of doing a PhD?
So yes, the question is, because I advise students not to do a PhD, and Caroline advises them how to do a PhD, can we confront three arguments? So in the review that I wrote of the book, I said it's the low pay, it's the lack of career prospects as a professor, and the stressful environment where the line between mentorship, competition, and friendship is blurred. So those were my three arguments that I think really should at least give people pause before they decide.
Yeah. And I'm saying if you do a PhD, you have to do it for the right reasons. So I'm not saying you should do a PhD. I'm saying convince yourself that you're motivated by the right reasons to do it. There are many reasons to do a PhD, but I say the most compelling one is that you're breaking and you're pushing through the frontier of knowledge. And so my personality and my beliefs, I don't think there's nothing more exciting to do, right? But so it fits my personality and my dreams and my aspirations. But if this is not something that someone finds completely, if it's not one of your top priorities or in your values, by all means, do something else, right? But I'd say pushing the frontier of knowledge, that's pretty cool. And impact as well. I mentioned I was doing research in laryngology. You go in and the kid doesn't speak, and then they have this intervention and the kid speaks. On a primary school playground, having a hoarse voice or not being able to speak versus having a normal voice. Think of what it does to the kid. I have just describing this, but what it does to a child development, right? So, but everyone finds their own impact. Some people want to clean the water, right? That's pretty cool too. Clean the air, reduce energy consumption. Right? Those are all good. So you need to find the one that makes you vibrate, really.
Now, that third aspect is something that you dedicate quite a lot of time, and we didn't touch on it. So interpersonal relations,
Yeah.
dealing with stress, dealing with mental health.
Yeah.
You do dedicate quite a lot of that in the book.
And I was helped, right? This is a subject that is where you have very smart people who dedicate their whole lives to it. And so I was, there was lots of hand-holding in writing this last section, because the book is it's not self-help in the sense that will cure mental health. It's self-help as in there is a current mental health crisis in education. We need to talk about it. We need to destigmatize it. We need to start a dialogue with all the protagonists. If it's not there, if it's there, we need to maintain this dialogue. And we really need to destigmatize it so people can get help, and help is provided. Service aux étudiants has a full-time hotline. We can go, we can have counseling at any given time. So it's there, but I think the engineers are so a PhD in STEM is even worse than the engineering department, because engineers are known for asking help less often. And so the crisis hits in graduate education because it's a 5-year, essentially, unemployment time where you've moved, you're away from your family, you're away from your immediate support network. But in addition, in engineering, engineers are known for not seeking help. And so the crisis is exacerbated in engineering faculties. So the idea, and there's a big disclaimer, you saw that, or a big disclaimer, this is not a cure, and this should not take the place of a good mental health expert, but it's there to say, if you recognize any of these signs, the schools, your advisor, your protagonist in your PhD should be there to help.
Okay. I would like to ask a question. Sorry, it's here. I already put it in the chat, but I'll ask it here as well. Related to the latest topic, because I teach psychology, about your opinion on the role of emotional intelligence in getting a PhD.
In getting a PhD, certainly, but in also how you exploit it afterwards. And I think so. Getting a PhD, it's part of your tool set. So yes, it's important, but it's how you exploit it afterwards, right? Which avenues you decide to dedicate your life after. I think it's, yeah, absolutely. It's part, and it's also there's this section on also individual assessment, right? So what's the career of your dream? And what are all the axes that are the best assets, the best skills that you could have? And if you see that emotional intelligence is part of them, how do you develop it? So I don't think I mention it per se explicitly, but clearly in the networking, this is part of it. Like, how do you develop an empathy? Talk about empathy in giving presentations, but also listening to presentations is part of it. The best collaborations is those that are started at a meeting, right? But I can tell you that as a grad student, my very first presentations behind a podium, you're vulnerable, right? You're there are 300 people, and you don't know how it's going to go. And my very first time, there was a researcher who full-blown attacked me, right? And I was like the clearly first-year PhD student. My advisor was front row. If you're going to attack someone, attack the PI, right? Go wait for the break, attack the PI. And so I think I defended myself quite happily, but that person, I can assure you, is in my little black book, right? This person, if they call me and they say, we'd like to have a free sample of your company, like a free book, or would like you to give a conference at our school, you can, rest assured, I'll say, no, this is it. And this is emotional intelligence. This is part of it, right? Who do you talk to? If you challenge research, why don't you challenge the undergrad, challenge the senior PI, that sort of thing. So I think there's a very strong part on empathy in listening to presentations and how you phrase your questions, such that we can advance science, but no one needs to feel threatened. Does that make sense?
Yeah, great.
would
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for this. Another comment, just a comment, because you already mentioned something about getting out of the comfort zone. I don't know if you are familiar with the growth mindset, versus fixed mindset. So I think you already mentioned part of this, so you can include this in the second edition.
I'm making notes. I'm taking notes for sure.
Yeah.
All right.
Growth mindset versus fixed mindset, there are different people with different mindsets. So some people are strict and some people, want to push the boundaries, want to go for more. So I think this is one concept that you can use.
And another concept that we explored, and I explored it with Virginie Francoeur, was the notion of stress versus distress, right? So eustress versus distress, and stress is good, right? But not intense and not prolonged, right? But stress helped you, right? There's nothing like the night before. I don't know for you, but there's nothing like the night before, right? But not prolonged and not intense and prolonged. Yeah.
Yeah. Actually, we view stress as positive. Thank you. Thank you for this answer.
Exactly. Agreed.
Sandrine?
Yes, I read an editorial, I think in 2023 in Nature, that was about the relationship between mentee and mentors.
Yep.
About maybe the fact that it's a bit outdated, like we don't have like an expertise to transfer to someone. Maybe I would like to have your opinion on how that has maybe evolved now that it's more multidisciplinary, and maybe how is it still a valid kind of training to have today?
Yeah.
So just a second, the question is, how has the mentor-mentee relationship evolved through the years?
So there's what it is. There's what it is seen by the mentor and what it is seen by the mentee. And that's super cultural, right? It changes on male, female, people from different countries, language barriers. So it can be many, many things. It depends on the management type. Do you have the micromanager, or do you have the, sink and swim approach? Throw them in the deep end and then see what happens. The book is not prescriptive in the sense that it doesn't come with answers, but with questions. And I think this relationship, is the most important one in your PhD. I think there's a clear correlation between the quality, the interaction and the outcome for sure. But it's not fixed. There needs to be a growth mindset out of it. And one way you can grow into that relationship is to, first of all, and identify what type of manager do you have. And that's very easy to do. You can ask other grad students, senior grad students, senior postdocs, what's the type, what's the lab culture? It comes down to it, right? And then also you can ask yourself, what are your expectations? And eventually the idea is that you get to, not through a formal meeting called expectations from 10 to 1, where for 3 hours but every time I think I would make a point, I would certainly make a list of questions of what are the axes where I need to know what the expectations are and what my expectations are. And every time I have a face-to-face meeting, I would throw one question, as opposed to discuss about sports results, right? So there's always the chit chat. Oh, and by the way, so I saw this conference, and what's the lab policy on conference? And then I was wondering, so congrats on your new publication, but what's your expectation for grad students? And my expectations were these. And as opposed, again, the Habs and the hockey results, it's great starter, a great icebreaker, but it makes for a much less memorable conversation. So, but again, preparation is key. So if you have this list of, I wonder what her thoughts on this are, and if you take a split second in the shower to think about it, then the next time you need to break the ice or to have a little chit chat, how about this? And the opener is easy. You just publish this. What are your expectations on this? By the way, so I thank you for funding, but for how many years do I have funding in your lab? Do you have funding all the way to the end? Am I expected to get some grants? Can I get funding to go to a conference? Am I expected to come to find the money through travel grants? what are your expectations? What are my expectations in terms of mentoring, right? So right now, things are doing well, but I wish I had more time to chat with you. Can we make a standing appointment, right? But if you come up with these questions, then during the limited face time you have with your advisor, throw in once at a time, I would say one at a time.
Yeah, perfect. Sujani.
As a young researcher, how would you recommend that, like, I face this limitation?
Oh, I thought I was a young researcher.
Well, you are.
A new PhD student, how would you recommend that we build our credibility in academia? Say, convince senior researchers of our ideas and creativity and.
So the question is how to create credibility as a young researcher.
Yeah. I would say, I'd say two fronts. The obvious one, sorry for stating the obvious. It goes without saying. Good research, sound research. The second one, I would see that I'm a good listener, show that I'm a good listener, and I would say generosity. Generosity, you have a new code, you work with your advisor, you can put it on GitHub, put it on LinkedIn, let people know that you created this tool for the community. So both fronts. Nothing beats sound research. But sometimes sound research, you know, there could be a Nature paper published in 3 years. And that's for 2.5 years of you being in the dark, right? Because a Nature paper is only 3 years down the road. It doesn't have to be Nature. Sometimes even optics editors takes 3 years. In the meantime, can you be generous with some methods that you put on GitHub, some, you know, as long as your advisor is fine with it. So everything in your lab is confidential. You cannot put anything on GitHub. Can you be generous and help organize an international conference? They'll pay for your trip and you're part of the organizing committee, being part of the student chapter of your local association, right? And so if you don't create scientific credibility, at least you show that you're willing to be part of the scientific society. And that's the first step. And then when your Nature paper comes out, everyone says, oh, of course, right? Yeah. Thoughts on this, perhaps? Do you have thoughts on
So
this?
I actually second that. The reason, so I told you, I thought I'm going to do science so I don't have to do networking. Like, really, that was my motivation.
I'm sorry.
Learned the hard way. 2008, you know, getting close to finishing my degree and thinking what comes next. So what do I decide to do? I decided to step out of my comfort zone and organize a conference. In my home country, in Macedonia, I invite my supervisor, fellow Macedonian, Borjan Gagoski. He may hear this soon. He invites his supervisor, Elvar Adolfsteinsen, and we put together a group of about 20 professors from around the world in this tiny tourist town in Macedonia called Ohrid. And for them, it was wonderful. They've seen a part of the world that they've never seen. And for me, it was a chance to get them drunk and you know, convince them to give me a job. Now, eventually, my postdoc offer didn't come from somebody at that meeting, but came from somebody who heard about the meeting and, you know, offered
That's
me
the
to come to
generosity
Montreal.
part, absolutely.
And then my postdoc was with Bruce Pike at the Montreal Neurological Institute because he heard that somebody did this thing in Macedonia. So put yourself out there. I think that's really the main message.
I often hear that in fields like health science, biomedical engineering, biology, you absolutely need a PhD if you want to advance your career. And even if you don't want to stay in academia, kind of jobs are looking for a PhD on your resume, on your title. Would you necessarily agree with the statement? Or do you think like an undergraduate or a master's would be enough if you want to like further your prospects in a non-academic?
I think it's
just
really...
to rephrase, sorry. So how essential is a PhD for a career in biology or other research-intensive fields?
So I think you're very lucky being at Polytechnique. We have the graduate career office where you have career counselor, and they would be the best person to answer that question. I think I would go on Indeed and Monster. Monster, does it still exist?
Yeah,
Indeed
Monster.
or LinkedIn.
Yeah.
But look at the or LinkedIn. Find the person who has the job of your dreams and then look at their credentials. And I think you can easily now run that sort of survey, but I would be talking out of my depth here. In my company, we have people thriving with technologist degree, undergrad degree, and PhD. So, but I'm not so sure about biology, but I would just go to a careers office here. Absolutely. Or look at LinkedIn. Find the people who has a job of your dreams. Type in job description, right? And look at people who have it, what degree they have. That will give you a good answer and a current answer as well.
I know you keep saying a lot of advices, but what advice would you give to students that want to follow like your same path, research a career and entrepreneurship?
Yeah.
So what advice to give to somebody who wants to follow in the footsteps of Caroline?
I would say build your core technology, build your core competency first, right? And then you can monetize it, then you can exploit it as an entrepreneur. Yeah, that would be, so first be known for something and then you can make it happen. Yeah, translate it.
It's,
Is there anything in your entire career you would do different?
Yeah.
What?
Ah.
what would you do different?
I would have asked more questions as a student. Yeah, I would have asked more questions as a student and more questions and I was very I'm always is, but I was very shy. Asking questions in class for me was excruciating, and then asking questions at conferences was really hard. And now I'm presiding over sessions, and whenever there's no questions, I have to come up with a question. I'm like, oh, it's really hard. So I would ask more questions. Ask questions, like, but you guys don't need that advice. You're really good at it.
Well, this is a class about asking questions, and they do get graded on asking questions.
Now you tell me.
But I think they've really exceeded my expectations today, and I think it's thanks to you. So thank you very much, Caroline. We really appreciated having you.
Thank you for having me.
And hope you can return again.
I'd love that. Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. So thank you to those on Zoom as well. On a short notice, we got some Macedonian researchers. So good to
That's
see you
very
all.
cool.
All
Come and
right.
say hi when you're in Montreal.
Yes, please do.
Okay.
Take care.
Thank you.